Myth number 1. Capitalism can grow infinitely. Capitalist growth is historically tightly coupled to ecological destruction, whether in terms of resource use or carbon emissions, and the continued search by political elites for year-on-year compound growth at all costs merely amplifies that. With new and supposedly sustainable industries popping up, green growth advocates often assume that economic growth can be decoupled from environmental harms. However, this remains an elusive ideal. In recent years, for example, electric vehicles have been displacing internal combustion engines, with some assuming that we can continue with expanding individualized mobility systems. However, enormous question marks remain over both the carbon implications of these technologies and their material needs, including lithium for batteries. While certain indicators might show signs of relative decoupling at local levels over recent years, there is no sign of any significant shifts, especially when looking across the global economy as a whole. And the global scale is all that matters in questions of climate change, for example. If anything, as scholars have shown, growth is getting even more tightly connected with environmental destruction. As Callis and Hickel note in their paper asking, "Is green growth possible?", models that do project green growth within the constraints of the Paris Agreement rely heavily on negative emissions technologies that are either unproven or dangerous at scale. Myth number 2. Capitalism is based on human nature. One idea which arises frequently is that the tendency towards competition, hierarchy, and inequity which we see under capitalism, where you have the separation of capitalist from worker, for example, or neighbours competing for status, is somehow naturally inscribed in our species being. One commenter on the last video put it that social hierarchy behaviour is instinctual primate behaviour. Relying on ideas of human essence and human nature is always a dangerous and slippery topic. If there is a universal in human existence, however, it is paradoxically the presence of social and cultural diversity. While some assume a state of equality and balance with nature in prehistory, and others that it was a time of deadly struggle and conquest, the truth as always is more complicated. As David Graeber and David Wengrow show in their landmark archaeological anthropological study, The Dawn of Everything, the longer history of human organisation has always included examples of vast societies showing no hierarchy. These were not exceptional or marginal. As they write, "If human beings, through most of our history, have moved back and forth fluidly between different social arrangements, assembling and dismantling hierarchies on a regular basis, maybe the real question should be, how did we get stuck? How did we end up in one single mode? How did we lose that political self-consciousness once so typical of our species? How did we come to treat eminence and subservience not as temporary expedients, or even the pomp and circumstance of some kind of grand seasonal theatre, but as inescapable elements of the human condition? If we started out just playing games, at what point did we forget that we were playing?" The naturalization of hierarchy is also strangely contradictory to the idea, held by other advocates of capitalism in the comments, that capitalism is somehow inherently associated with democracy or freedom. In reality, there are many shapes and sizes of democracy and markets which can exist, many predating capitalism. And of course, countless examples today of capitalism operating in the absence of freedom. One would have to think that if these people really cared about democracy, they would find the concepts of worker, producer, and consumer cooperatives interesting, for example, to maximize democratic involvement. But instead, the naturalization of hierarchy within capitalism is fallen back on as an excuse for tyranny on larger or smaller scales. Myth number 3. Capitalism is based on the free market. The myth of the free market deserves a video all of its own, but it suffices to say that what we describe as capitalist markets in recent centuries can fit no decent definition of free. Given the prevalence of clientelism, monopolization practices, wealth and political power concentration, intervention being required to stop economic crises, non-market innovation, such as citizen-funded research, which is later parasitized on by capitalist firms, there is no way we can say that the societies we describe as capitalist are based on competition within a free market. Markets are always socially and culturally embedded institutions anyway, not natural entities. There is no abstract level playing field, and anything approaching a free market is exceptionally rare. Weaponizing the idea of a free market in this context, while often done in the spirit of finding a path to freedom, which of course should be applauded, simply justifies continuing accumulation of private wealth and polarization. Government regulation and community oversight have played enormous roles historically in protecting people from the monopolies and externalities which emerge under industrial capitalism. Most of those who defend this system in the comments are benefiting from socially funded and built infrastructures, like roads, the internet, and power grids, to name just a few, which have almost nothing to do with markets. Myth number 4. Capitalism is the most efficient economic system. This one comes back to the idea that through the market mechanism, capitalism sheds inefficiencies naturally and leads to a more effective drive for innovation or growth. One comment under the last video countered this myth well, however, when it stated that efficiency can only ever be evaluated in relation to some value. If that value is profit-seeking and surplus extraction, then capitalism is very efficient. If that value is human or life-centric, capitalism is horrible. So yes, the term efficiency is extremely debatable. Either way, in relation to its use when speaking about the environment and efficient resource use, for example, the reality is that only direct protection of the environment and degrowth or sufficiency-oriented measures will suffice. Efficiency will only play a minor part in that. As has been shown time and time again, rebound effects, otherwise known as Jevons paradox, mean that in a growth-oriented economy, more efficient processes will actually lead to increased resource use. Efficient LED lighting, for instance, means that more lighting is used and overall energy requirements rise. Efficient engines mean people drive more and more people have cars, causing gridlock and different forms of pollution. This is something we must learn to deal with socially and politically, not relying on some mythical capitalist efficiency. And finally, myth number 5. Capitalist growth helps people out of poverty. The idea that the majority of the human population lived in extreme poverty until the dynamic engine of capitalism dragged them out of it is a powerful myth, but it is just that. One recent study, linked to in the description, flips that argument on its head. The rise of capitalism from the long 16th century onward is associated with a decline in wages to below subsistence, a deterioration in human stature, and an upturn in premature mortality. Where progress has occurred, significant improvements coincide with the rise of anti-colonial and socialist political movements. As advocates of degrowth note, reducing poverty through economic growth is a very circuitous and counterproductive way of doing things. There is no necessary connection here. The Indian state of Kerala is a good example of somewhere which instead relied on improved democracy and social policies and practices, not industrial or economic growth, and in doing so, radically improved the lives of its citizens in both rural and urban areas. In the 1970s, the rate of absolute poverty in Kerala hovered around 60%. Today, by some measures, it has the lowest poverty rates of any state in India, despite not even being amongst the top 10 richest states. Keen on-market political interventions are to thank for this, targeted at the most marginalised, including land reforms, female empowerment, grassroots healthcare, pensions and wealth distribution. Perhaps most interesting is the decentralised planning system brought in, which I will discuss elsewhere. Either way, while not a utopia, Kerala has the highest life expectancy in India, the lowest maternal and infant mortality rates, and the highest rates of literacy, achieved with no fundamental emphasis on growth. So those are 5 myths about capitalism and growth, which I hope bring some light, or at least provoke thought. What are your thoughts on this topic? Are there other myths you think are worth discussing? Let me know in the comments. And as always, if you would like to see more about topics like this, subscribe and have a look around elsewhere on the channel.